We are so excited in the Unashamedly You community because so many of you are joining us in the same room this weekend to be encouraged, enlightened, and empowered to run after your God-given calling. And I cannot wait to hug your necks. If you're not at the Unashamedly You conference happening this weekend, we will miss you, but keep listening because next year's conference schedule will be released soon. Hello and welcome to the Unashamedly You podcast, a space to enlighten, encourage, and empower you to go out and unashamedly be who God is calling you to be. I am your host, Jamie Herndon. I pray you hear less of me and more of Him as you listen to today's episode. Let's grow together. I am so excited to be bringing on a friend of mine. She has the biggest and brightest smile to make any and every person feel so welcome. But one thing I love about this young lady is her love for God is so evident. She exudes the love of God and her love for people and of souls, and it is so obvious. I am honored to have her as a guest with us today, and I just cannot wait for all of us to get to hear from her. London Bradford, welcome to the Unashamedly You podcast. Take a moment and introduce yourself to all of us.
I am London Bradford, like you said. I currently live in Rosarito, Mexico. So that's in Baja California on the far, far west coast, just south of San Diego. I am married. I've been married for just over a year and a half. I'm originally from Sacramento, California, but now I'm in Mexico.
And we're going to talk a little bit about that and how you got there. So that's exciting. One thing that we wanted to chat about today is the amazing clothing line that you have,
Yes.
the Young London, such fun clothes. But tell us a little bit
Yes.
about this brand. You've had it for a couple years now. How you got started with this?
So we've been open. We'll celebrate 3 years in October. And we opened kind of like in the height of COVID when we had a little bit more time. And it was one of those things that wasn't one of the blessings of COVID, if you will. My mom and I had always done clothes, created. It seemed like anytime there was a conference or a trip or something fun, we were always creating something special to wear. And it was just a fun thing that my mom and I always did together. And we had thrown the idea around of selling them, making them, making it available for people. We'd done a couple things as gifts and it never really stuck. And it wasn't until 2020 that we really had some time to sit down and talk through, well, if we were to do this, what would it look like? And the more we talked about it, the more we really put it into play. And we're like, this is something that we want to do. And so we opened in October and it's a bit creative. It's a bit fun. It's a little bit fluid. You're going to get something that hits kind of a 12 to 15-year-old. And you're also going to get something that hits, a more mature woman in her 60s as well. And so the idea is that we're women and clothes are a large part of our identity. I mean, they're part of everyone's identity, but especially as women, it's a large part of who we are and representing yourself. And I think that as women who dress modestly, it's a way that we can really be creative and express ourselves in a way that's not just, well, I dress modestly, but instead it's, I am a creative person, I am a happy person, and I enjoy getting dressed. And that was something that was big for us, was making clothing more fun. And if you've ever seen my mom or I, we probably have something a little bit random on, a little bit weird. And we wanted to be able to provide that for people who aren't just stuck in your same easy model. Nothing against that, but if you want to have a little bit more fun, we might have something for you.
You definitely have a very fun clothing line. Every time I see it, it always looks so cute. Sometimes a little bit more fun than what I personally
And
think
that's
about it. I'm like,
okay.
I don't know that I'm this much fun. But my daughter Ada, she is definitely fun, creative, and she loves everything the Young London puts out. So you said that you and your mom got started with this together. You'd never had a clothing line before, right? Besides just putting some
No.
fun things together for you guys. Were there any hardships in getting started? And like, how did you know what to do?
Well, there was definitely a learning curve when we launched, and then we realized, okay, what do we do now? And so that first week was definitely full of hardships. So if you bought from us the first week, we love you so much. But, throughout that, we've face different hurdles that, you really don't know how to anticipate or what to expect unless you've read all of the business books and unless you've, seen everybody's model and listened to all the podcasts. You really don't know what's going to hit you and what you're going to face. And so that was some of the fun things, was just, okay, well, do we have enough shipping bags to get us through? Or, you don't know how to anticipate. And then as time went on was, okay, well, where are we going to store everything? Because when we started, we had adequate storage. We still currently operate out of my parents' house, out of their garage apartment that we have totally commandeered. So the kitchen cupboards are full of clothing. There's racks and shelves in the kitchen and in the bedroom and all of that. So the bed is a really great place to fold clothes. But in all reality is, at that point, especially, we didn't really feel like it was worth going and renting out a space. So where do you store your things? So do you have the racks to store them? Little logistical things that you really don't know how to prepare for. And then moving on a little bit, a year and a half, I got married and moved away. So that was kind of hard because my business was based in Sacramento. And at the time I lived in Bakersfield. So that was definitely a big hurdle for us to overcome and figure out, how are we going to operate? Should we move the business? Should we continue to operate in Sacramento? Definitely full of challenges.
But you've seemed to overcome them and now
Yes.
have a very successful business. Do you guys just mainly operate online?
We do. We mainly operate online. At this point, the business is based in Sacramento and I live in Mexico. So I can't be there to run a day-to-day shop. And the reality is, Sacramento is not necessarily the target market for us at this point. The majority of our shopping is online, maybe at some point. And we've done a couple pop-ups locally, but we do primarily online shopping. And then we'll do at conferences or events, we'll do a pop-up, which seems to go really well. And, obviously drives business to your online shop as well.
If someone's listening to this and they've not heard of the Young London yet, where can they find you?
So you can find us on our website, theyounglondon.com, or on our Instagram, The Young London. We also have a Facebook, but it is not as active because I am a millennial and I'm a really bad Facebooker.
I definitely love Instagram more too. But you guys, if you're not following her, then you need to do that because her clothes are a lot of fun. And it's fun just getting to see some of the styles that they put together, because sometimes they put together something and I'm like, oh, I could put this with that, or I have a dress similar, but I need that
Yeah.
shirt to go underneath it. So it's fun. And you also have a kids' clothing line.
Yes, we do have a kids' clothing line. It's a little bit more traditional. Our women's clothing is obviously a lot more creative, a lot more crazy, if you will, as people often put it. But the children's line is a little bit more traditional shapes, cuts, styles for children.
It's all so cute. I love it. But one thing that we have seen from your entire family is your love for the mission field. And you have mentioned a couple of times you're
Yeah.
now in Mexico. We'll talk about that. But you guys have been heavily involved with Hope Corps, Roatan. I see all of your trips. You make
Yes.
everyone want to join that opportunity. But tell us a little bit about how your family got started and involved in this. And how did your love for this missions work evolve?
So I joined Hope Corps in 2011. I was 16 years old and I was graduating high school that year. And my brother and I actually signed up together and we did the courses, and then we went on our ITW to Belize at the time. And with my parents, we had done missions and things like that before, but that was probably the first thing that I had done that was something I chose to do and went on my own. And that was for me like a catalyst of wanting to do more for the kingdom of God and wanting to do more, not just locally, but globally. And it really opened up my heart to realize more of the needs and more of the opportunities, both globally and locally. And since then, I think I've only missed like 1 year of Hope Corps just because of life circumstances. But other than that, it's been something that I have been super passionate about ever since. And so it's been like 12, 13 years that I personally have been involved. And primarily we wind up in Roatan. I've done a couple other ones, Norway. We did Italy this year. That was really neat. My brother has done New York. I have never done New York. But we wind up in Roatan a lot because some of our really good friends are the missionaries there. And so obviously that kind of helps and ignite your burden into what they're doing. And getting to be a part of something like that as a young person, or, as a more mature person, it really does something to you. and not only missionally, and obviously that's my heartbeat with where I'm at in this season of life, but even locally, it's been one of those things where year after year, it really reignited that passion to do something for the kingdom of God. For me, it was on a Hope Corps trip where I decided to go home and start a bus route. And at that point in my life, I was a part of a group who grew our bus route to over 250 children and adults and families. And so for me, that particular ministry that was a really big part of my life was started because of Hope Corps and countless other things, my passion for missions, obviously, and many other aspects of ministry in my life.
What is one of the most memorable experiences that you have had being on a road 10 trip?
Wow. Honestly, that is a really big question because there's so many that come to mind. But I think one of the top moments, it's kind of something that potentially, would happen every year. It's not necessarily a moment, but a feeling and an experience is every year getting to come back and see people. You go into these villages where they live and they don't have running water and they don't have electricity. And then they come to church. You see their demeanor change. You see their attitude change when they walk into the house of God and when they're surrounded by people who are of like-minded faith. And no longer is that disparity of, we're Americans and we live a much more privileged lifestyle and they're, living this lifestyle they live. But immediately we walk into the house of God and we're all there together worshiping God and watching that happen, especially with young people who may come from a neighborhood or a community in the States that's more privileged and they've never experienced anything outside of the world that they live. And then they've flown all this way for the first time. Oftentimes they're away from their parents for the first time. They're out of the country for the first time. They're in a totally new environment. But immediately you see this uniting of spirits and of the way the Holy Ghost just moves. And it's so powerful. And it's year after year and trip after trip. It brings me to tears just watching them together. And you see lives change, not only just in the people there in Roatan, but you're also seeing something change in those young people from the States and all over North America. But it's such an impactful moment.
Wow, I love that. The Holy Ghost just really has a way of uniting everyone, even in the States. You coming into church and people are coming in off the street, or they're coming in from having a bad day, or they're in the middle of these terrible life circumstances. And then some people are in the middle of victory and they're in the middle of the
Yeah.
best times of their lives. But when you get in the presence of the Lord and you're all worshiping together, it's like God is meeting every single one of our needs individually. And that sounds exactly what it's like, even in Roatan.
Yeah.
I love a saying, it's called unconscious preparation. And that is something that we have talked about many times, my husband and I, how God will unconsciously prepare you for what's coming next.
Yeah.
And seeing your life personally, I see that the Lord has unconsciously prepared you. You went on that trip in 2011, probably not expecting to become a missionary yourself or to ever leave your hometown, your parents, but you have done that recently. You said, you recently got married and then you've recently moved yourself. Tell us a little bit about how this all came about.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that the last 10 years specifically, but my life has been a life of unconscious preparation. Really, it seems that every step of my life has been preparing me for this moment, and who knows what this moment is preparing me for next. But my husband and I got married in January of 2022, and we were married for about a year, obviously. And God really began to deal with us. And we just felt like we were supposed to do something, but we really didn't know what that was. And so we began to pray and fast and seek the will of God. We talked with our pastor. I talked with my parents. We began to really search after what God was calling us to do. And we didn't know what that looked like, what it was. Was that something locally? Was that something outside? And as we continued to pray and fast, it felt like really no direction was coming. And at that point, you can be a little discouraged because we obviously were feeling something, but we weren't sure what it was and continue to just not find direction. And Peyton and I had gone to Sacramento for a couple days. I was going home to work and he was just hanging out with my family. And while we were there, Boston said, "Hey, this is super random, but I'm flying down to Mexico to help with a dedication or something." I honestly don't remember. It was something very random that was unexpected. And he's like, why don't you come down with me so that you're not like here by yourself while London's working? And so Peyton was like, oh, okay. So he hopped on a plane and flew down to Mexico with my brother. And while he was there, they were doing all the things and going to church, and lots of exciting things were happening, but it really was unrelated to Peyton. And Peyton being there was just on a whim. And so while he was there, Brother Rodriguez, who was the missionary in Ensenada, brought up to him, he said, hey, so what do you think about Mexico? And Peyton was like, oh, I love it. We're having a good time, just very lighthearted. And he said, well, what do you think about moving here? And Peyton just started laughing. He was like, oh, that's funny, oh, not yet, whatever. And that was the end of the conversation. And he wound up driving home to Bakersfield, and I met him in Bakersfield. And he said, on the way home, it just really began to deal with him. And the more he got to thinking about it, and he said, I began to ask myself questions. What would that look like? Okay, move to Mexico, do what? What, how does all of that process? And so he and I met at the church. We were having youth prayer that night. And so we were sitting there in the church kind of after prayer was over. And he's like, so Brother Rodriguez asked me to go to Mexico. I was like, oh, that's cool. And he's like, no, like to move. And so he began to explain what the situation was. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. He's like, well, what do you think? And obviously Peyton had already dealt with that moment. I could tell, but it hit me. And I was like, immediately, it felt like the right thing. And I had never been, at that point, I had never been to Rosarito. I really didn't know where it was, but it was truly a God moment. And from that moment on, obviously we prayed and we fasted to confirm what we were feeling. But from that moment, we really felt that that was what we were supposed to do. And so I think it was 2 or 3 weeks later, we came down here for the first time just to see the city and make sure we knew what we were agreeing to. And as we began to drive around and explore the city, obviously that burden and that passion began to ignite. And we went home, I believe it was on a Friday. And so we called our parents and, a couple people, and we're like, so we're going to Mexico. And from that moment on, I think it was 14 or 15 days after that Friday, there was a confirmation of something, either a family member connected, a friend that was connected, a business opportunity, something or another for 15 days in a row from Rosarito. And so obviously we really took that as, okay, God, we hear you. And yes, we feel confirmation from you that this is where we're supposed to be.
That is incredible how that the Lord works. He was just there on a whim. You guys were feeling and you were praying after something. I want you to talk a little bit about saying that you were praying for something and you did not know what it was or what you were feeling from God, because someone may be listening to this right now and they're like, that's exactly where I'm at. I am in that place and in that spot where God's saying something's coming, but I have no idea what's coming. I don't even know how to pray. I don't even know what to seek after the will of the Lord for, besides saying, God, I'm here, I'm willing, I'm ready, but you don't know exactly what it is. Talk to that person that's in that moment right now.
I think it's a really uncomfortable position to be in, honestly, to be completely honest. And as someone who was just recently in that position, we felt something so strongly, and we knew that we were supposed to do something, but we had no idea what it was. And we were youth pastors in Bakersfield, and we loved it. We loved being in Bakersfield. We loved being in our local church. And we weren't even sure if it was just, okay, dig in here and do more here. But we just knew that there was a shift in some sort. And so as we began to feel and seek after what that shift was, we prayed and fasted and reached out to obviously our family and our pastor and asked them to pray with us, because obviously that's the voice in our life. And so if you can't hear God, then your pastor might be able to. And so we began to seek God together, but still there was no direction. There was no booming voice. There was no still small voice. There was nothing. And we talked about time and time again in that season was, well, we're here right now. Let's continue to do what we're doing. And so we didn't allow our duty locally to suffer because of that. Even though we weren't sure if that's what we were supposed to continue to do, we knew that's what we were supposed to do right that moment. And so we continued to do that. And as we began to pray and seek after God, honestly, I told Peyton one night, I said, do we just not know how to hear God? Because I know he's speaking. I know something is happening because we feel this, but I just don't know what he's saying. And an opportunity had arisen for us. And it was something that we actually really wanted to do. And we were really excited about it, but it just didn't sit right in our spirits. And the more we prayed about it, the more we just felt nothing. And so that was kind of when I said, well, are we just waiting for something too big for God? Like, are we waiting for a big booming voice, or is just this opportunity here him speaking? But we also felt it wasn't right, even though it was what we really wanted to do. And so we just continued to seek after him. And I think that being in that place, it was the perfect place for God to speak to us without us being so unsure and being in a place of limbo where we were just waiting for him to speak. Peyton probably wouldn't have even taken Brother Rodriguez seriously because it was such a casual conversation. But because we were in such a heightened state of hearing from God, I think it put us in the position to truly hear from him.
Those moments where we're just waiting on God, we're waiting on him to speak. We've all had those moments more than
Yeah.
likely. I know that I have been there and you're just waiting. And that's whenever a lot of times I'll remember that thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light into my path. And I don't always want him to just light my path. I want it to all be lit up. I want to
Yes.
see my future. I don't want to see my next step. And then sometimes it's just in the waiting and you're just having to sit down
Yeah.
and wait on God. But those are the moments where, like you said, he can move and then you can be heightened to knowing and to hearing his voice at a time when you may not would have heard that if you weren't seeking after that. It's
Yeah.
what we're seeking after. That's what we're going to find. So now you are in Mexico. Tell us a little bit about being there.
So we've been here since January of 2023. So just over 6, 7 months, somewhere in there. We had come one time. So it was a little bit sight unseen. It felt like where we live is essentially a suburb of Tijuana, which I'm sure if you've ever seen anything in the news, everything about Tijuana is terrible and scary and awful. So obviously, you come down with a little bit of apprehension and obviously fear of the unknown. Rosarito is very much a suburb. It is not Tijuana, but it gets stuck for Tijuana oftentimes. It's right on the beach, so that's really cool. We have really cool weather. It doesn't get too hot, doesn't get too cold, which as a Californian, that makes me really happy. So the whole start of this from Brother Rodriguez was they had a small group, I think it was 3 families who had connected. It's a really cool story. The way God just works is we have a family who wound up down here in Mexico without any friends, family, didn't know anybody. They were out of one of the works out of Brother Jordan Copeland's church in Buford. And because of life circumstances, they wound up down here in Mexico. And once they got down here, they didn't know anybody. They didn't have friends, family. They didn't have a church. And so they watched church online, and probably became a little bit disconnected if in all reality it was COVID, all of those things. And they just kind of slipped away. Well, a friend of theirs had gone to Mission Possible in Memphis at Brother May's church. And Brother Ben Rodriguez had testified or was preaching. I honestly am not sure what year it was. And he began to talk about Ensenada. And when he was talking there was a woman in the audience from Brother Jordan Copeland's church who was friends of the people from here in Rosarito. And she said, hey, there's an apostolic church down there. You need to connect with them. And so after that, this family here in Rosarito began to drive to Ensenada, which is about an hour, hour and a half every Sunday to go to church. And so that was really awesome for them, a really good connect point. Obviously, they were getting to go back to church. It was a really big moment for them. Well, in that process, they had reached out to a couple people they had made friends with, connected with, and it wound up being about 14, 15 people who were driving every Sunday to Ensenada. Well, that's not really sustainable, obviously. And so the Rodriguezes were coming over on midweeks, somewhere in the week to try and do Bible study. And then the group was driving over, but gas is expensive. Getting a vehicle is expensive. The people in our church were actually selling their clothes at one of the local markets every Saturday so that they could raise money for gas to drive to Ensenada and go to church each week. And so obviously that is not a sustainable long-term solution. And so Brother Rodriguez had been praying for something to happen. What was the right option, what was supposed to happen here, because obviously they had this opportunity, but it wasn't a long-term solution. And so right about that time is when Peyton came down. And so Brother Rodriguez asked him to come. And obviously we're here now. So when we came, we started with 14 people. It's 3 families and then a bunch of kids. And since then, last week we had 36 in service. So the church is growing. We're having a revival. And God is really doing big things down here. We just got the opportunity to work with one of the women in our church. She invited her coworker and he came to church. He currently lives in a rehab center, and rehabs here in Mexico are a little bit different than a rehab center in the States. Once you're checked in, you do not check out until your time is over. There's no getting out. And they're treated a little bit more like the prison system as opposed to like a care facility. And so your family can check you in, the government can cause you to be checked in. So he had fallen into rough life circumstances, wound up in this rehabilitation center. And since he's been in there, he just recently got his privileges to be able to come to church. And so he wound up coming to our church. He got the Holy Ghost. And in talking with him after service, we found out that he used to be an apostolic preacher, but because of life, it had just fallen apart, and he wound up addicted to drugs and in this facility now. And he's doing better. He's been there for quite a few months now. After him coming, he came to church for a couple weeks. He began to talk with my husband, and he said, I really would like for us to get to be able to do more. And so 2 weeks ago, we got to go in and we did a Bible study. In the facility, there's 120 men. About 85 of them showed up last week, and they did an hour-long Bible study in conjunction with Saved and Sober out of Sacramento. And last week they did it, and there was about the same amount of men, and they've now afforded us the opportunity to every Friday, we have an hour to teach whatever we want to teach. So it's really exciting.
God is so good. How he works completely blows our mind. His ways are higher, his
Yeah.
thoughts are higher than what ours are. And it's just neat to get to be a part of God's kingdom, a part of his work,
Yeah.
which is something that we're all striving to do. And that's one thing about Unashamedly You, is talking about unashamedly going after God's calling in your life. Everyone's not going to be called to be a missionary. You're not going to be called
Yeah.
to go out and to be able to do those things, but everyone is called to do something. He's calling all of us to do something in his kingdom. And so going out and doing that, hearing the praise reports and the incredible things that God's doing is so exciting. And that's a super exciting time. But at the beginning, leaving, I know how close you are to your brother and to your family, and leaving could not have been something that was easy or something that you did lightly. Even knowing you're answering God's call, we still have emotions and feelings. Maybe talk to us for a second about God's calling and knowing that it's his will, but still having to answer that call and having to go through the things that aren't always easy to go through to get to that.
I think it's a really weird position to be in, because you know that you're doing what you're called to do and what you're supposed to do, but yet your flesh fights that. And so not in necessarily a carnal way. It's not sin, but myself, I want to be home. I want to be with my family. My sister's having a baby. I want to be there for that. But that's not where I'm called to be. And so I think it's a regular struggle of your spirit. And obviously moving, that was a big moment of transition and fighting that spirit. And my husband and I were actually just talking about it this week, and we were saying, I don't know that it ever gets easier. There are days that it's okay and you're fine and you don't struggle with that part of it. But then there are days where I just want to go home. I'm homesick. It's the reality of life. But you wrestle it down and you fight that flesh. And so, you ask God to help you and you find strength in it. Not obviously, I think it helps when you truly are in the will of God, because again, it's not something I'm just weeping over every day. I don't face it all day, every day, but there are moments where you wish you were home and you wish you could be there. I wish I could be there for my nieces growing up, and my mom is unwell. I wish I could be there to help her. I wish I could be there for all of the exciting things happening in my family's life and in my home church and at home. I want to be a part of it, but that's not who I am anymore. And I have to accept that God has called me to be something different than who I used to be. And as much as that can grate against you, that's where God's calling me to go and who he's calling me to be. And that's part of my struggle with being who God has called me to be.
That is so good. Where you said, God is not calling me to be what I used to be.
Yeah.
Calling you to something higher, to something new. And answering that call is not going to be easy, but the peace that comes with answering that call
Yes.
is so worth it than to stay where you were, because yes, where we are is easier. It's our comfort zone. It's comfortable. I mean, everything that we hear about Mexico, I don't even want to go on a cruise ship to Mexico. I'm like, Lord, please don't ever call me there. And so, yes, you hear so many things about it and leaving and going there and just knowing God's calling. But when you stay comfortable in the flesh and you're a praying person and your spirit's no longer comfortable
Yeah.
and you're not comfortable being there anymore, that's not worth it either. I know
No.
that I have been called to things and called to do things, even with starting Unashamedly You and starting this community, starting this podcast. I had gotten to a place where I was so uncomfortable being in my comfort zone and being what I considered comfortable that I was willing to give the comfort zone up to be comfortable in prayer and praying
Yeah.
and to do what God was calling me to do. So this has been so amazing today. Everything that you have said has been so helpful. And I know that you are helping someone that is in those same steps, that God is asking them to go somewhere to do something and he's calling them to something else. They may be in that waiting period. I know some things that you have said has been helpful to them. Thank you so much for being on here today. But what are some last thoughts that you would leave for us here in the Unashamedly You community today?
As someone who truly does strive to be who God has called me to be, I think that buying into what you feel like God has called you to be unashamedly, without question, without doubt, as difficult as it is the most fulfilling thing that you will ever do. And whether that's starting a business, whether that's working in a new environment, whether that's getting married and moving, whether it's becoming a missionary, starting a bus route, just starting a fabulous conference and a podcast and a whole new community, whatever that is, I think that when you step into the calling that you feel from God, you will find a peace and a joy, truly, that in spite of all of the difficulties and the hardships that you may face in that new season, there's a peace and there's a happiness that is unmatched by anything else.
It reminds me whenever you were talking of the scripture that we use here in the Unashamedly You community, and it's 2 Timothy 2:15. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. Thank you so much, London, for being on here today. Your words have been so helpful, and we are so honored to have you a part of the podcast. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Unashamedly You podcast. If this podcast session has blessed you in some way, we would be honored if you would leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. And as always, shout us out in your stories on Instagram and tag us. We thrive on your reviews and are so thankful to each one that takes the time week after week to let us know how a podcast episode has blessed or helped you. Go be unashamedly you.